Hello, and welcome to the second lump of words that is Hoganory. I am Warner Hedgehog's very low-cost avatar. Pull up a beanbag, breathe in deep, and flop down like some sort of overcooked lettuce. Now open your lungs and listen to Chuffing Marvellous.
I feel funky.
Then dance a monkey.
Are we in session?
Is that your question?
Who wrote this word bog?
Warner Hedgehog.
What's the story?
Hoganory. Now close your eyes and visualise a wide hilltop surrounded by fields. Picture, if you will, the paused image of a man in the dead centre of the hilltop, standing in a defensive pose. Now add to that an equally paused, sodding massive cloud of crows caught in the middle of bearing down upon him, each crow with murder in its eyes and in its collective noun. Now use your internal graphical processor and imagine being able to rotate around this horrific scene of impending violence. Zoom in on the man's face with its weird mixture of fear, smugness and hacked off anger. Now pan over to a randomly chosen crow and examine its very annoyed, beaky visage before pulling out once more to survey and maybe rotate about the whole scene. Now let us refocus on the man and in a low budget and definitely rubbish special effects sort of way rewind a few days. Meet Adrian Plumsize, a low-life scumbag and very amateur kung fu enthusiast. Plumsize was a drug dealer, con man, would-be pimp, and generally horrid little twerp. The big problem with Plumsize was his enormously swollen ego. He thought he was the bee's knees, the king of the local horrible heap, when in fact he was just a nasty little vicious low-level tit. He was convinced he knew better than anyone and that soon he would go off to Colombia to get into the game good and proper. All his mates ignored him, thinking similar words to fat chance, and got back to hoping he'd just sod off. He was at a local pub on band night. Hugh Jars and the Butt Gags were playing, and they had a good reputation as a party band, and everyone would turn up. And it would be this fateful night that Adrian Plumsize would meet Sister Crozophine, leader of Hoodlum Corvid gang, the Bum Hill Chuffs. She was here to check out the band, as well as to pick up some stuff for her gang of delinquents. Unfortunately, she had found herself talking to Adrian. As usual, he was bigging himself up to his regular heights, claiming he could get all the best shit, top quality, 100% pure and all that. He said he could get anything they wanted. Wombat, armadillo, floor sweepings, smut. Any hit they desired was his for the offering. Well, the Bum Hill Chuffs were properly into floor sweepings, a sort of cannabis-like narcotic that gave the user what couldn't really be called either a high or a low, but more of a middling. When you took it, you just went blank for hours. And as a bunch of useless Corvid Herberts, they bloody loved it. Yes, there were side effects, such as pink beak, and all your tail feathers went curly, but never mind petty little things like that. During their conversation, the fat-headed Adrian Plumsize didn't hesitate to big up his abilities and connections to the absolute max. He apparently knew all the best geezers in the game, and could easily get, for an almost modest fee of course, the very best floor sweepings in the entire Western Hemisphere. They negotiated a deal and money was exchanged. Within mere moments, Plumsize was on the blower to a mate, arranging her next day delivery. The following afternoon, the Chuffs received the coveted package, and they tore into it with glee and set about rolling some epic joints. 10 minutes after lighting up, and they were starting to get the impression that their little bundle of chemical fun might not be quite as advertised. 20 minutes later, and the Bumhill Chuffs were a very unhappy bunch of birds, and were not vastly impressed with the gall of one Adrian Plumsize. Luckily, the gang had a very useful member known to all as Jiminy Jackdaw. Jiminy was a crow with a pal in the science community. Jiminy's pal was not only a mere chemistry whiz, she was Betty Might, the lead researcher of the Slapshire Generic Boffins Association, the county's answer to the rest of the world's scientists, and a very handy plot device. After a quick phone call, a large sample of Plumsize's wares was sent to Betty, who would then subject it to severe scrutiny. It didn't take long for such a loftily positioned egghead to learn all that was possible to learn from the sample, and it transpired that the high-quality stuff that Plumsize had promised the Chuffs was about 5% actual drug, 60% dried lawn cuttings, and 35% random stuff that had seemingly been swept from the floor of a grotty warehouse. That news settled it. Under the guise of wanting to set up a permanent arrangement, they would invite the cheating little git to their hilltop hideaway for a little chat. The gang would then find out just what was going through his little weaselly brain, and then they would slaughter him and feed his stupid carcass to nearby gang, the Tit Valley Pigs. The following day, Adrian arrived in his flashy and overly noisy car, and swaggered over to Crozophene, full of bravado and his own brilliance. He was consequently quite surprised when the whole gang surrounded him and tied him to a chair, demanding answers. It transpired that he had been selling increasingly watered-down gear for years, bulking stuff up with whatever cost the least, and wasn't noticed. But this time he had gone far too far. He said he was very, very sorry and would never do it again, trying to appeal to the gang's better nature. But unfortunately for him, they had done their homework and knew much about Adrian Plumsize, including his lifelong aversion to telling the truth. They asked him what he thought he was bloody well playing at, but even as they spoke, they knew his answer would be whatever he thought would save his sorry skin. They also knew he fancied himself as something of a self-defence expert, so they offered him a very slim chance of survival. They dragged the bound-twerp to the centre of the hill, and one member of the gang cut his ropes. He stood up and smirked, convinced he had the gang's number, because he really did consider himself the absolute authority on all methods of self-defence. The sad truth was that all he had ever done was sit about watching Bruce Lee and Donnie Yen movies, and actually knew very little and was capable of far less. Sister Josephine and her band of feathered ruffians prepared to attack, but despite being faced with a veritable cloud of opponents, Adrian Plumsize stood there like a supremely overconfident prawn in a poor attempt at a kung fu pose. With one large squawk from their leader, the gang attacked. Close your eyes and remember the frozen scene from the beginning. Rotate and pan about the scene and consider the impending frenzy of bloodshed and violence. Try to imagine how Plumsize would move, considering that he's a useless, egocentric pillock. Visualize him being assaulted from all sides at once by a gang of very angry crows, and his pitiful and honestly rubbish attempts at fending them off. Now unfreeze the scene. Adrian was at the centre of a veritable hurricane of feathers and vicious action. It wasn't very long at all before he was completely overwhelmed by the corvid attack. When the crows were spent, the black cloud of birds dispersed, and a pathetic, mangled corpse of a once smug drug dealer was revealed. He had managed to take 3 gang members down with him, and they lay equally lifeless next to him. The crows were buried in the closest thing to a cemetery they had, a little copse known as Dead Git Corner. As was planned, the remains of Adrian were dragged off with very little ceremony to the neighbouring Tit Valley pigs, who gobbled him up in their own sweet time. What they didn't eat, they just chucked into a ditch, as they didn't want him cluttering up their nice home. So there you have it, the tale of a drug-dealing ratbag. If there's anything to learn from this, it's that if you're going to stone the crows, don't cheap out on the quality of the weed. Crows, as it turns out, don't like skinflints, which in the end is an important lesson for us all. Until next time, goodbye, my little terrapins.